mentioned last Sunday morning that the new year had not started off as great as I may have wanted it to. And in fact, something happened within the first week of the year that as we're going to be paying for. We're going to be paying for probably numerous months, maybe in a couple of years. But that we're going to be suffering through, primarily Martha's suffering through it, probably till the end of March, April, sometime around there. But I think all of us have had situations where we started a new job, or we started a new opportunity, or we started off a new venture, and it seems like sometimes, just starting right out of the gate sometimes, we make a mistake, or a trial comes our way, and it derails us completely. It seems like every year I have the same New Year's resolutions. One of the New Year's resolutions that I always have is that this year, Lord, I'm going to lose weight. And sure enough, within the first 10 days of the New Year, something comes up that's going to prevent me from being able to go on the exercise program that I had planned on doing. You know, I had planned on starting exercise and lifting weights and doing things like that. I had not planned on my exercise program being helping my wife walk and move around and giving her baths and things like that. That was not on my agenda of what my exercise program was. But sometimes God throws things in our way to see how we're going to handle it. Sometimes Satan throws things in our way to see if he can derail us. I'm reminded, it's actually interesting that I'm talking about that this morning, because I have a friend of mine that I went to school with and I went to church with. And today is her birthday. She turns 38 today. But when she turned 16, she went to the DMV like so many other 16-year-olds do when they go to the DMV. She went to the DMV to take her driving test. And she got into the car and she did all the mirror checks and all the buckled in, did everything right. And she puts the car in reverse and she begins to back out. And as she's backing out, she backs into the driver instructor's car. She put the car back in the gear, went back into the parking spot, unbuckled her safety belt, and just said, "I guess I failed." And sure enough, she did. She had to take the test again. But sometimes that's what happens to us. It's like right out of the gate, right out of the starting block, we make a mistake or we mess up. And we have the opportunity to either to learn from the lesson or to just sit there and take it. Sometimes we like to have self-pity parties for ourselves. But we can either learn to move on, or we can just sit there and just lay around and feel bad for ourselves. As we turn to Genesis chapter 12, what we find is we find the story of Abraham. We talked last week about Abraham's call into faith and what the call of faith involved, what he was supposed to do and what that call of faith did. But today, what we see is a detour of doubt. What happens is he begins to doubt some of the things that God had promised him. And while technically speaking, in Abraham's life, this is not really him stumbling right out of the gate. But as the story is read, we've only been introduced to Abraham for a few short verses. And within 15 verses of being introduced to Abraham, he screws up. He makes a mistake and he begins to doubt and distrust God. It's like right off of the starting block, right off of the starting block. Abram fails his first test, taking a detour of doubt that leads to suffering and leads to disobedience, and it leads to trust. God had called Abraham to faith. It was a life that was supposed to be of blessings. It was supposed to be obedience. It was supposed to be a life of worship. And when he comes to his first test, he fails it. And because he fails it, the trials begin to get worse and worse. So what I want us to look at and what I want us to talk about this morning is the detour of doubt and what happens in that detour that all of us have taken at some point in our lives. Starting with verse 10 of chapter 12 in the book of Genesis, it says this, "And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarah his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife. And they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. And it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abraham well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maid servants and she-asses and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his wife with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Why saidst thou, She is my sister? So I might have taken her to me as my wife. Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, and silver, and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we thank you. Lord, we thank you for this day. Lord, we thank you for your word. Lord, we thank you for the example of faith that Abraham is to us. But God, we also thank you for the Bible's account of him, Lord, that it is completely and totally honest and unvarnished, Lord. We can learn both from Abram's triumphs and his failures. And God, we ask that you would use this time. Help us to see Abram. Help us to see his lack of faith. Help us to see our own lack of faith through his life. And God, also help us to see your faithfulness through all of these things. Lord, we just ask all this in your Son's name. Amen. So God had called Abram to be a vessel of blessing. He had called him to be to have blessings. He was to be a vessel of blessings. He was to have land. He was to have descendants. He was to have prosperity. He was to have all of these things. He was to go out and worship God and to bring other people to God. He was called to do all of these things. He was called to be obedient. And at the first sign of trouble, really, Abraham begins to doubt. What happens is that he did the same thing that many of us do. He had a response of doubt in a trial. He had a response of doubt in a trial. There was a famine in the land. Now remember, God had promised him, I'll give your descendants these lands. I will give your family this land. You will become a great nation. And as soon as a famine comes, maybe I'm being a little exaggerated, but when a famine comes into Abraham's life, and a famine comes into the land that God had promised him, he begins to doubt God. And what happens is, to many of us, and what happened to Abraham is our response to trials, our response to trials is that of doubt. And when we have doubt, what we do is we begin to be suspicious and we begin to strategize. We have suspicions and we have strategy. And we see this in two specific ways in the life of Abraham in this trial, in this trial right here. What we have here, first of all, is we have this famine. We have the famine that comes. There's not any land. There's not any rain, and the land is beginning to suffer. It's not as bountiful as it was. And Abram looks down to Egypt and he sees the Nile, and the Nile, it was a breadbasket, many people have said, of the area, and he goes down into Egypt. But the famine comes and he has suspicions. He begins to fear whether God will actually take care of him or not. God had promised him the land. God had said, I am giving your family this land. But what he's fearful of is that God won't take care of him. That God won't take care of him, and the land that God had called him to, God's not going to take care of him. He begins to have suspicions about this God that had called him out of Haran, about this God that had called him out of Ur, about this God that had promised him many things. And when a famine comes, he begins to doubt whether God will or even can take care of him. So when he has these suspicions, he begins to strategize. He begins to come up with a plan. Well, what am I going to do? Well, we'll go down to Egypt. That's what everybody else in this land is doing. We'll go down to Egypt. They will have food. They will have grain. They will have the things that we need. So we will go down to Egypt. And with all due respect to the King James translation, the word there, it says that he went to Egypt and went down into Egypt to sojourn there. The word sojourn there implies to us that Abram was just going for a visit and he was going to come back. But the Hebrew actually indicates that he was going to Egypt to stay. Things aren't working out here. There's not enough food. There's not enough grain. There's not enough water to take care of all of our stuff, all of our animals, all of our herds and our flocks. We need to go down to Egypt because things will be better there. Abraham did the same thing all of us do in life. He began to look in his neighbor's yard, and his neighbor's grass was greener than his grass. So he said, if I just went down there, things would be better. So Abram had suspicions that God wouldn't take care of him, and Abram strategized a plan to take care of the problem and the fear that he had. But it goes even further than that. When he goes into Egypt, he knows that there's going to be another problem. When he gets into Egypt, he knows that people are going to be looking at his wife and saying that she is a fair woman, that she is a good-looking woman, that she is a woman that people would want to be married to. He begins to have suspicions. And the suspicions he has is very important. It's very important that we understand. God had promised him land, and he had promised him descendants. He had promised him land, and he had promised him family. And his suspicions, his fear is that God won't take care of me and my land. And his suspicion is, and God won't take care of my family. So he comes up with this plan. Quite frankly, it would only work in a society like Abraham's. Today, it would be a harebrained, pea-brained scheme. Because there ain't no woman on the planet today in the United States, at least in this culture, if I was going to go somewhere else, I could not turn to my wife and say, honey, you know, you're a really good-looking woman. And when we move to this town, they're going to look at you and they're going to say, I'd like to marry her. But there's a problem. She's already married. So we're going to kill him so we can marry you. So what I want you to do is when we get there, I want you to say you're my sister. Martha would probably tell me where I could go, which would be to go there by myself. And I'd probably wind up going there by myself. She would not say, I'm her sister. And see, we could get away with that because I could say, see, Martha, it's not really a lie because, see, you're a Christian and I'm a Christian and we're both part part of the family of God. So technically, biblically speaking, you're my sister in the Lord and I'm your brother in the Lord. So we wouldn't really be lying. See, that's what Abraham did. So Abraham went to Sarah and said, Sarah, I want you. I know you're a fine-looking woman, and when people see you, they're going to want to have you as their wife, and they're going to kill me so that they can have you. I want you to say you're my sister, because it's not really a lie, because you're my half-sister. You're kind of my sister. See, Abraham had suspicions that God would take care of him in the land, and Abraham had suspicions that God would take care of his family. And when he did, what happened was he began to strategize. He had suspicions that God would take care of his family, and he came up with this plan. And what happens is that often when we begin to go down that detour of doubt, it begins with suspicion and fear that God can't take care of us. Or even worse, that God won't take care of us. So what happens is we begin, because of our finite understanding and our weak hearts and our weak faith, we begin to think of ways that we can work ourselves out of the problem instead of trusting God to take care of it. And almost always when we do that, instead of just trusting God in the trial, instead of just trusting that God will do as he said that he would do, that he will take care of us and that he loves us, and like we said last Sunday, that he's got this, instead of trusting in that, we begin to come up with a plan because we don't trust God. And when we do that, it usually results in disaster for us and for the people around us. And the same thing happened to Abraham. Because of his response of doubt to trials, it resulted in doubt's tactics. We see the results of doubt's tactics. He came up with this plan. We'll go down to Egypt, and you'll say you're my sister, and everything will be great. They'll take care of me. It will go well with me by saying that you're my sister. Now, some commentators seem to think that this wasn't quite as self-serving as it sounds. That what Abraham really was thinking is that if he was the brother, then they would go to him as the patriarch, even though he wasn't her patriarch, he was her brother, and they would negotiate the plans for a wedding with her through him, just like they had to do with Laban for Rebecca. Jacob had to do with Laban for his daughters, for Rachel and Leah, and that he was thinking that they won't kill me, they'll just have to negotiate with me. And any negotiations that come up, well, I'll just squash them. And everything will be fine. But see, what he didn't plan on was Pharaoh. The one man in Egypt that didn't need to ask for his permission. And what happens is that we have the tactics, the strategy, the response of doubt. The response of doubt being suspicion and strategy. And then the results of doubt's tactics are treasure and torture. And I know that sounds a little, contradictory. Treasure and torture. When do we get treasure out of doubts? Well, many times we actually get blessings when we take the detour. It's Satan's way of trying to keep us in the pit he's dug for us. But other times, there's suffering. So we have treasure and we have torture. And we actually see this in all the three main characters. We see this, first of all, we see it in Pharaoh. And I'm not trying to be crude or trying to be disrespectful towards Sarah or any woman at today or even in that day, but Sarah herself is the treasure that Pharaoh received. Now, we don't know whether he actually took her as his wife, if you catch my meaning. Many commentators suspect that he didn't because of the way the text is read. It doesn't say anything about bedchambers. It doesn't say anything about her being with him. It doesn't say it just says he took her as his wife. So it's very likely likely that Sarah came out of this unscathed. But Pharaoh saw a fair woman and took her into his harem. But he also received torture because he received these diseases, these plagues that came upon him. And the word that's used there to describe the diseases is one that was often used to describe leprosy. So it was a skin disease, more likely than not, of some kind that afflicted Pharaoh. So Pharaoh receives the treasure of having this fair woman becoming part of his harem, of joining with Abraham, because many times when he got married, it was more about, when you were a powerful man, it was more about having an alliance with a powerful person than it was about anything physical. So he had that treasure of an alliance with Abram. He had the treasure of having her in his harem, but he also has the torture of the skin disease that comes. Now Abraham, on the other hand, he receives treasures from Pharaoh. Pharaoh, he gets exactly what he said he would get. He said, "It will go well for me. Sarah, I want you to say you're my sister so that when we get in the land, it will go well for me." And that's exactly what happens. It goes well for him. He gets riches. He doesn't get money. He gets servants. He gets animals. And it's kind of important to see the kind of animals he get. He didn't just get donkeys. He got female donkeys. And female donkeys were prized during that time, because I'm sure you ladies would be fascinated and surprised to find out that female donkeys are easier to train than male donkeys. Female donkeys are less stubborn than males. Now the guys, we might disagree with that, but the female donkeys are less stubborn and they're easier to work with. So a female donkey was a prized possession during that time. She received male servants and men servants. He received male servants and female servants, maid servants. Many commentators suspect that this is when Abraham picked up Hagar. We'll talk about that later. That worked out well too. But the other thing that he received camels. And liberal scholars look at this and say, oh, you can see that this is a later addition because camels weren't being used at that time. They had not been domesticated. It probably is a later addition that wasn't part of the original script, and it wasn't part of the, if Moses wrote it, he didn't talk about camels, but it might be something that was added later after the exile, because by then camels had been domesticated. But now they found through archaeology that camels were just beginning to be domesticated at that time. Why is that important? Because it means camels were the new iPad. They were the new iPhone. Camels were the newest technology. If you could afford a camel that was trained, you were rich beyond your means, because you could afford the newest stuff. So he had trainable donkeys. He had male servants and female servants. He had the newest means of transportation and labor in camels. Abraham was getting blessed. But I think that in his treasure, he also was having torture, because he was getting exactly what he said he would get. It's funny sometimes how, when you look at Scripture and you pay attention to how people speak, sometimes God uses our words against us. Abraham said, "It will be well for me," and it was. It was well for him, but it was a horrible situation for his wife. He was getting all of this stuff, but she was in the harem waiting to be called to Pharaoh's chambers. She was in torture. And it's almost like one of the commentators actually said that it's like Abraham's words got stuck in his throat. And I imagine that he was tortured by guilt, because he got exactly what he said he would get. And sometimes when we strategize and when we plan, we get exactly say we're going to get. The problem is it's not always what God wants. It's what we wanted. Our plans come to fruition. It's like that Garth Brooks song. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. Sometimes God answers them just to show us this isn't what you want and this isn't what you need. And I believe that's what happened to Abraham. Abraham went down to Egypt and he told Sarah, you be my sister down there and everything will go well for me. And God said, yeah, it will. But we see that Pharaoh got treasure and torture. We see that Abraham got treasure and torture. Poor Sarah, all she got was torture. She had the torture of being separated from her husband. She had the torture of being separated from her entire family. Now, I know she didn't have any children, but she had lots. She had the maidservants. She had, which would have been, to an extent, an extended family. She was separated from them. But she was also tortured by humiliation. This was a man that claimed to love her. And he just allowed her to be taken. Now, I suppose that if you're the kind of man that would go into a town and say, honey, why don't you be my sister so it will go well for me, then you're probably not going to be all that tore up about the fact that she's taken from you. But Pharaoh had to kill me. I don't know how you guys feel. Wouldn't have mattered how many female donkeys and how many camels he threw at me. He'd had to kill me. So Sarah had to live with the torture of knowing that her husband cared more about his own skin than he did hers. Be honest with you, if it had been my sister, Pharaoh probably would have had to kill me. So regardless of the fact that she was his wife, she was his half-sister. And he didn't do much to protect her there either. And see, what happens is what we see here is that God had called Abraham to be a blessing. He was supposed to be a vessel of blessing. But instead what he was a vessel of suffering. Because of Abraham, Sarah was suffering. Because of Abraham, Pharaoh and his whole household suffered. So instead of being a blessing, he was a suffering. He was a vessel of suffering. And sometimes disobedience does that. It leads to suffering. Sometimes it leads to suffering to us. Sometimes it leads to suffering to others. But often it can bring us blessings, which is kind of a suffering all of its own. Because we were being blessed, we're getting all the stuff we wanted, but we know we're out of God's will. And that brings a whole other kind of torture and a whole other kind of guilt and a whole other kind of suffering. The suffering, when it's caused by disobedience, what the intent there is, the reason God allows that suffering is so that we'll come home. It's just like the parable of the prodigal son. The prodigal son took half of his father's belongings. He took his inheritance and he squandered it. And it wasn't until he was on his knees eating pig slop that he decided he would come home. And sometimes that's what has to happen to us. Sometimes we have to get on our knees and we have to be eating pig slop. Sometimes physically, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. Before we make the realization that we need to come home. That we need to return to God. So we see the response of doubt and trials. We see the results of doubt's tactics. But what we finally see here is we see a return to faith's turf. We see a return to faith's turf. He leaves Egypt and he goes back home. He leaves Egypt and he goes back home. And this cycle usually follows two specific things. Three specific cycles. It usually follows 3 steps. First, there's rejection. Then there's restart. And then there's reception. See, what happened was that when Abraham looked at life, when he saw the things going on in Bethlehem, in Bethel, not Bethlehem, but in Bethel, he had the famine. And he looked down at Egypt and he said, if I can just go down to Egypt, I can restart and everything will be okay. I can restart and everything will be okay. But when he gets down to Egypt, everything seems to be working out. And then God intervenes. He's been faithless the whole time. He didn't believe God could take care of him in the land. He didn't believe God could take care of his family. He decides to go down to Egypt. There is no reference to going to God, to seeking God's voice, to seeking God out. God doesn't say go down to Egypt. He says, I'll go down to Egypt. And while we're down there, Sarah, you be my sister. And what happens is that he gets rejected. So there's the rejection that he receives in Egypt. And literally the instructions that Pharaoh gives him, he tells him, he says, Pharaoh commanded, he says, so I might have, he says, therefore behold, verse 19, now therefore behold, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. Literally in Hebrew it's 3 words, take, wife, go. He's so fed up with Abraham and the torture and the sufferings that he's brought into the house. He brings him in here and he says, why did you do this? Take, wife, go. Get out of my presence. And as I'm reading this and I'm thinking about the Israelites and how they left Egypt, several hundred years later, God brought plagues again, and Pharaoh tells them again, go, take all your stuff and go. You've become a stench in my house. Here's the same thing. Abraham had become a stench. He's rejected Abraham. Abraham thought everything would be okay. He was not going to Egypt just for a little while. It wasn't like he was running down there because he isn't. I'll use you as an example, Mitch, because I know you've been looking at jobs outside of the state because of the things that are going on with you. And you might be taking those jobs. You might wind up having to take it, but it might not be a long-term solution for you because you're still going to be looking for something closer to Burke County. That ain't what happened. That's not how Abraham viewed it. Abraham got a job in Gaffney and picked up his whole family and moved to Gaffney. And when he gets there, he gets rejected. So what happens? He's driven out of the land, and he has another restart, another new beginning. He said, I think things will go great in Egypt. No, not so much. Well, I'll go back home. I'll go back home. And he goes back to Bethel. It's interesting how it says, and he went even to Bethel unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning. In golf, they call that a mulligan. A mulligan is when you shank it so bad out in the woods that the people that are with you, they don't want to. In reality, this is how I think how it came up. You shank it so bad it goes out in the woods, and the people that are playing with you don't want to wait for you to find the ball, so they say, why don't you just shoot again from where you're at? That's what happened to Abraham. Abraham made a colossal mistake and left the land that God had gave him. And he gets to go back home. But whereas he was rejected when he went to Egypt, he has a reception in Bethel, because I believe when it says there, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Right there is where his restoration with God happens. He was there to build altars, to praise God, to worship God, to be a witness, a light in that community, in that land. And he had done great up until a trial came. And that's when he took that detour of faith. That detour of doubt. And he goes off on his own direction. See, we've all experienced this detour. We've all experienced this detour that doubt sometimes can take on us. Or sometimes takes us on. But because God's grace and His mercy, and it's only because of God's grace and mercy, we have to recognize that this is not a story about Abraham's faith. This is a story about God's faith. This is a story about God's faithfulness to Abraham. Abraham had no faith. He doubted that God could take care of him. He's going to go down to Egypt. Everything's going to be great. This God that called me out of here, He can't take care of me, and if He can, He's not going to. If God had not sent the disease to Pharaoh's household, it's a good chance that Abraham would have stayed in Egypt. God stepped in and showed His grace and mercy to Abraham. Showed it through suffering. God stepped in and changed it. He is faithful to receive us, even when we've been unfaithful. I've told this story a couple of times, and I know I've used it probably too much. But it's one of those things that I can't get away from. And I was talking with Adam Duncan this afternoon after the service. I know for a fact that if I had succeeded at the first job I took after I got out of college, I wouldn't be here today. Because I took a job working in a pest control company, and I was a pest control salesperson. Can you believe that? I walked around outside of people's homes looking for anthills and telling them they needed pest control. That's what I did. Drove Martha crazy because we'd go to putt-putt, and I'd say, I missed that shot because there's this ant crawling across here, and he distracted me. I've always got an excuse. But I took that job, and if I'd have been making the sales that I was supposed to be making 15 years ago, this is a job I took in 2001. If I'd have been making the sales that I was supposed to be making then, I would be making then what I'm making now. 15 years ago, I'd be making then what I'm making now. If I'd been making then what I'm making now 15 years ago, I'd have kept on that track. I know it, and God knows it. That's why He made me a lousy pest control salesperson. Because when I got out of college, I started to think I could do it on my own. I started to have this doubt that God really wanted me to go into ministry. I started to doubt that God really had a plan for me. Because in fairness to myself, in fairness to my 22-year-old self, I did put in applications at churches as a youth pastor and did try to go down that path, but the doors just didn't open up. I actually met with 2 search committees, and the doors just didn't open up for me. And the place that I was staying so that I could get a job where I wanted to get a job, where I wanted to minister, that fell through, and I wound up having to go back home. And I just figured, okay, God, you're done with me. And if I'm honest, part of me was like, and I'm done with you. Maybe I'm not done with you, but I'm done with this silly idea that you want me to be a minister. And if I'd have succeeded, I might have never turned back. And see, I think that God, through his blessings, made sure that I didn't succeed and I suffered. Those of you that have been down that detour of doubt, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because you've had those experiences in your life. There's times in our life where we decide we're going to take a detour. I don't know why GPSs keep coming up in my mind, but they do. Because there's times that I'll be in an area where I'm familiar with, and the GPS will say, turn left here. And I'll be like, what are you talking about? That's a dumb way to go. You don't know how to get there. I know how to get there. I grew up in this town, and you're not telling me how. And then I don't do it, and then I wind up somewhere, and I don't know where I'm at. And I wind up having to go back to the stinking GPS that I told didn't know where it was going. Turns out I'm the one that didn't know where he was going. And that's what happens with God. He'll say, stay on this highway. No, Lord, we're supposed to turn off here. This is the way Granddaddy did it, and this is the way Daddy did it, and this is the way I'm going to do it. And then we get there, and it's like, I've been down this road 15 times, and now I don't know where I'm at. If we just would listen to God. See, Abraham was called to do a specific thing. God called him to have faith. He told him, I'll give you blessings. He said, you will be a blessing. He called him to be obedient. He called him to have faith, to be obedient, to be a blessing, and to worship. And Abraham said, yeah, but God, I don't think you can do it. And he goes off on this detour. He has a response of doubts and trials, and he has suspicion, and he comes up with a strategy of his own. And that what happens there is that we see, with that, we see the results of doubt tactics. He has torture and he has treasure. And then finally we see a return to faith's turf. He gets rejected. He goes back home. And he gets received. Maybe somebody here is on the path of faith and you're facing the possibility of thinking that you need to take a detour. Maybe you've struggled with it. Maybe you're on the path of faith. God wants us to be on that path of faith. Are we being faithful to God in his call for us? Are we being faithful to God in his call for us in our life where we have been placed? You know, I know it's been a while since we've done a lay renewal weekend, and I know it's been a while since we've kind of even talked about it. But if you remember back at the Marketplace Evangelism weekend, God has placed you in a place to do ministry. God has placed you in a place to do ministry. And he has equipped you to do the work that no one else can do. Now, he may raise somebody else up to do the work, but he's called you to do it. We've all been placed in a place. Are we being faithful to the mission and the ministry that God has called us to do? Maybe we're on that detour of doubt. Maybe we're kind of standing at the crossroads and God's saying, hold the course, hold the course. And we're like, but Lord. Maybe we just need to stay on target. If you're in one of those places, which pretty much is all of us, then the altar is going to be here. because we can, praise God that He's been faithful to us, and He's forgiven us, and He's called us back home and gotten us away from our detour. Or we can ask God to keep us from taking that detour. Or we can ask God to save us from the detour that we've taken. And for some of the younger people that are here, I want you to know. And Kevin, I can't remember the quote that you said that your daddy gave you when you were a young person. But sometimes, I said that the detour, Abraham got to come back to the starting point. Sometimes those detours, we don't get to come back from them. Sometimes we make mistakes that there is no changing. Maybe we walk away from church and our life goes off rails, and God might bring us back, but if we were promiscuous, God might bring us back, but that doesn't mean He might not. He might bring us back with a disease. He might bring us back with a child. We might go off corrals and do something where we're drinking and we're doing drugs, and He might bring us back, but He might not bring us back with a healthy body. Abraham was lucky. Because there is no such thing as luck, right? God showed Abraham grace and mercy. He doesn't owe any of us grace and mercy. And we can get on those detours, and sometimes He brings us back to the starting point, but sometimes we get dumped off somewhere else. That's just as a word of maybe scare tactics, I guess is a better word for it. But even though, that's more true of younger people, but even as we get older, we can make mistakes that are irreversible. I'm a grown man. I put quotes because so many of y'all keep reminding me how young I am. It's good to hang out with young people so they can remind me how old I am too. But I can make mistakes. But the mistakes that I'll be making now, I won't be the only one suffering. If I make a mistake in detour now, I have kids that can suffer. When Abraham made his detour, he really wasn't the one that suffered. But we've all been through that. We've all been through those detours. We've all experienced them. Maybe God brought us back to the same point we were at. Maybe He put us off somewhere else. But we're back on the trail of faith. We're back on the path of faith. Pray that God keeps you there. Thank God for bringing you back. The altar will be here for you. Let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you again for this day. Lord, we thank you, God, for how you are faithful to us. Because, God, you are so faithful. You love us even when we doubt you. You love us even when we fail you. God, you love us regardless of anything we have done, could do, can do. God, you love us because of who you are, not because of who we are. So, Lord, I come to you today just thanking you for the times that you've saved me from those doubts, those detours that I've taken. Lord, thank you for always bringing me home. Because I know, God, that I would not have done it on my own. It is only because of your grace and mercy that I stand here today. So, Lord, you for all these people here who have experienced these detours, Lord, but you've always brought them back home. God, for those of us here that may be on a detour, Lord, I pray that you will bring them home. God, if it be in your will and if it be in your mercy, Lord, bring them home unscathed. But Lord, be with us tonight as we come to you. Lord, help us in our journey of faith. God, we just ask all this in your Son's name. Amen.
Stand together.